Welcome to today's session. I will introduce our moderator, Carla Bailo, that will introduce our first speaker from Deloitte.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and lead this session today. And we all have a presentation to share to kick off, and then we'll move into Q&A. So I'd like to introduce Scott Corwin, who's the Managing Director and Leader of Future of Mobility from Deloitte.
Carla, thank you very much, and thank you to the IIoT team for inviting me to participate and be with you this afternoon. I am looking forward to sharing some perspectives. So this works. I think I need to be handed control of the screen.
You should have it right now. Scott?
Yeah, it's not letting me, sorry.
It's not letting you, okay. 1 second, I'm on it. Okay, so I can advance for now.
Okay, that's great. If we could do that, that would be great. So,
okay.
We started this journey on the future of mobility about 5 years ago, and Deloitte was very much, what we were finding is that our clients were asking us about a whole series of trends related to innovation, fundamental shifts in consumer attitudes, and the emergence really of new, the shifts in powertrains and decarbonization of mobility to smart, intelligent materials that change form factors, to ubiquitous connectivity, and the rise of the shared economy, and then finally autonomy. And if we go to the next slide, please. Where a lot of that has led us towards is this idea of seamless integrated mobility. And when you think about the challenge that we have for what we're calling a fit-for-purpose mobility ecosystem, it starts, and this is really from pre-COVID, that the rise of urbanization and growing populations. Today we have roughly 7.7 billion people on the planet, and over 4 billion live in cities today. And according to the UN, that number is going to get to about 10 billion by 2050, with 2/3 of the population living there. That means that we're going to move, essentially, we're going to grow by 50%. We have a mobility or transportation system, a legacy one, that generates 1.3 million deaths a year, that we have real shortfalls in funding for infrastructure and modernizing our transportation systems. We have massively rising inequality where mobility is the key to people improving their lives, their families' lives, access to education, access to healthcare, access to broader communities. What we've seen is a rise in the last few years that I think is very interesting, and it's the emergence of all of these new modes of transportation. And arguably it started with Zipcar 20 years ago, where essentially on a fractional basis, you could rent a car for an hour and go run some errands, and then ride hailing and bike sharing and on-demand shuttle buses. The emergence now of long-haul trucking that's AV and last mile delivery, and scooters, and eventually Hyperloop, and really a whole range of things. The challenge has been that most of this is a supply side led innovation, and it's been done to cities by and large, not with cities. And so there's a real challenge of how do we optimize this mobility system. And that has really been the focus of the work that my team and I have been doing over the last 5 years. If we go to the next slide, please. At the core of this is this idea of seamless integrated mobility and how we move from point A to point B. And we're getting now, we've seen a lot of progress where people will use different modes. This is just an example of someone commuting from outside a city into the city, then the last mile part, and all of the supporting systems. What's really interesting behind this is not just the fact that you have those options, but it's the digital network that's enabling that. It's the technology that's enabling that. And if we get this right, we have the chance to create a mobility system that is faster, safer, cleaner, cheaper, more inclusive, and more accessible than today. We have a long way to go. If you go to the next slide, Deloitte has been working for the past, can we go to the next slide, please? Deloitte for the last 3 years has been working with the World Economic Forum to advance the idea of seamless integrated mobility. And it started with actually writing a manifesto to help cities and the private sector begin to really understand what it will take for this to happen. And then we spent the middle year working in Detroit and Ann Arbor and Windsor to catalyze some of this. And then this past year, we actually wrote a white paper where we went and looked at 10 cities to uncover kind of the best practices for seamless integrated mobility. And the cities are listed at the bottom, but we found a couple of things that I think are really interesting. These are very different cities. The approach that they've taken is different. And what you find when you go to cities, including these but others, is that every one of them is going through their own journey. And they're kind of wrestling with a lot of the same issues. And so we thought it would be really valuable to help provide insights about this. And one of the common findings are political will is a key determinant. Carla and I did some work in Columbus, and we clearly had that in place. It was really critical for its success. Governance structures matter. In too many cities, there's a really wide dispersion of the governance authorities that actually influence the way that transportation and mobility decisions are made. It's a relic, if you will, from a century ago when these things were really formed, and we kind of almost need a new governance structure. There are pilots everywhere. I think what we're finding now is that it's time to move beyond pilots and really focus on things that not just the art of the possible, but actually scale them to have impact. What we found with the cities that really are moving forward is that they established a clear vision, and it helped them really make really profound trade-offs. And successful mobility systems require partnerships, funding, and talent. And then the last thing is that there's a great rush for data. Data is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's really in how you use it. And what we found when we looked at the differences of these 10 cities is that they were wrestling with choices between, do I optimize an individual's journey or do I optimize the system? Is the innovation led from the public sector or is it private sector led? What is the relationship in terms of our views towards data openness and transparency versus privacy and security? And is it a marketplace that's city regulated or market-led innovation? And in many ways, these are false choices. It's actually both in many of these instances. And each one of these cities is actually ending up in very different places about how they're doing it. If we had time, I could walk you through them. I encourage you to download the report. It's available at the World Economic Forum. It's also available at Deloitte in our Future of Mobility homepage. If we move on to the next slide, we then took that work and COVID came along, and like good consultants, we spent a lot of time, a lot of our practices have really thought about what's the impact of COVID-19 on their sector. And we decided to do it around the future of mobility. And we just released this Memorial Day, and it's a product of work that our leaders in our strategy practice, who happen to be some of the most world recognized strategic planners, along with Salesforce, where all of them had been part of a spin out of Royal Dutch Shell, which is considered the sort of citadel of strategic planning. And they did this really looking at COVID, not mobility or the healthcare sector. And essentially they laid out 4 scenarios. And we decided to apply those scenarios to the future of mobility. So we wanted to look at, with COVID, how long will individual attitudes and behavior change around mobility? How quickly does automation accelerate, particularly in goods movement? How do supply chains shift to become more resilient? What new health measures will be required in transportation? What happens to shared mobility in light of people's concerns? How do public transit systems cope? How many trips will be replaced by us going virtual and remote in terms of e-learning, telehealth, and working from home? And then the second part of this is what's the economic fallout? So how will government rescue efforts affect different sectors? What investments do companies pull back from? How does funding for mobility startups and innovation shift? And how do local authorities deal with the revenue crunch? So if we go to the next slide, I want to just give you a quick overview of the 4 scenarios. And let me just preface this with a couple of comments. One, scenarios are not meant to be, this is exactly a crystal ball of what the future is. They're meant to be narratives that help leaders in all different places begin to contemplate different alternative futures. These, as I said, were originally developed broadly, and they're predicated really on 2 fundamental dependencies. One is the duration and severity of the pandemic, and the second is the extent of the government's response. So the first scenario is it's like a typical V-shaped recovery, that the pandemic is contained effectively by governments, but it is not without some lasting and uneven economic repercussions. From a mobility perspective, we believe that it will lead to some enduring shifts, that most of the players will go back to the roles they had pre-COVID, and it will kind of feel like a typical business downturn where dynamics will play out and it will take time. The second one is we called good company, and it's around the idea that the governments struggle to move forward and get this pandemic resolved, that the pandemic takes longer, and that in their place, particularly the delivery of public goods, are provided and increasingly by the private sector. And in mobility, that may lead to the fact that the tech players who have played such a disruptive role will play an even bigger role going forward. The third is sunrise in the East. And it's the idea that China and other East Asian nations get their arms around the pandemic earlier, recover, have government systems that enable them to move forward, and that some of the things that we've been seeing around innovation and R&D and consolidation of value chains continues, but also a willingness, if you will, to use data in ways that maybe we in the West wouldn't be fully comfortable with. And that essentially we see a pivot on a global basis where they will rise and that they will begin to export a lot of mobility innovation. The last one is one where the pandemic goes on a long time and governments don't cooperate. And essentially it's, we turn inward and it's a very nationalistic kind of view, and government effectively becomes the driver and regulates this and probably funds all of this. So we could go deep into this. We've done a lot of sessions on this. I would really encourage you to read the piece. We lay out in it what are the implications for the auto sector, for the tech sector, for public transit, and we try and lay out so that they have a real understanding of what this means. And the idea behind this is we don't actually know what's going to happen. So people who tell you, here is what's going to happen, I don't think that's true. So in 3 to 6 months, we'll know a lot more. This was meant to start a dialogue, and it was meant to really frame the way to begin to think about it. The one thing we did walk away, which if we go to the next slide, is that regardless of which of these scenarios takes place, there are some no regret moves. The question is, how much will we stop traveling the way we did pre-COVID with telework, telemedicine, and e-learning? These may become new norms in the way that we lead our lives. We're working in New York with the Partnership for New York City, which is doing an impact assessment on COVID-19, and Deloitte is leading the healthcare sector. We've had a chance to connect with all of the leading large healthcare providers. They've been talking about, the future of health has been talking about telehealth for 20 years. This pivoted to that in a really quick way, and all of those providers don't believe we're going back, that this is the new normal. And the question is, how do you actually integrate that into the systems of what they're doing? A focus on safety. We've always had a concern about safety, but it's taken on a new meaning, which is there's a hidden threat here that none of us can see. None of us can sense. It's different than being on a subway platform where you might feel a little uncomfortable, or you're by yourself late at night somewhere, or you're in a taxi that the driver's not driving well. So for sure, figuring out how we're going to sanitize our transportation, whatever form it is a no regret move that's going to be required. And if we can't figure that out for mass transit relatively soon, our cities are not going to come back quickly. E-commerce, many of us who have retreated to our homes and quarantine have become even bigger users of e-commerce. And the big winners here for sure is the movement of goods, and those players that are really focused on the movement of goods and last mile delivery. And a lot of the AV technology companies are clearly pivoting to this place. And then the last is sort of a reconfigured mobility landscape. There's a lot of uncertainty. Some of the shared providers, I was talking to the head of mobility and innovation in a European city, and he's really worried that their bike sharing and scooter sharing systems, that those companies may not survive, and yet they're very important as part of his overall transportation system. And he really doesn't want that market failure to happen because it takes away options that they've grown accustomed to and are very important. So we're at a really interesting crossroads. All of this innovation, all of this momentum, what's going to happen? Will it continue? And I would just suggest that with all the federal aid that's being given to the airlines, to mass transit, and to the auto players, I helped to write the bailout plan, that the request for federal funding for one of the global OEM, the US OEMs. And what will happen with that funding, and it's necessary, is to keep these companies alive and afloat. But essentially, the investment in innovation is going to get cut. The question is, for the private sector funders, the venture players, what's going to happen with all the uncertainty exists? So we are at a really interesting crossroads, and I hope, Carla, we can get into that today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. One question that did come in is if we could share the link for this material, and I tried to share it from your slides, but apparently it's not working. So if you have a chance to put it in the chat box, that would be great.
Somebody has already done that. So probably one of my team members has provided the links.
Fabulous. All right, thank you.
And if not, just let us know and we'll get them to you.
Okay, great. So let's move on to the next slide if we could. And I'd like to introduce John Gradick from McGill University, who's a faculty lecturer who will give us his view. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Carla. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, folks. It's been a pleasure to be here and to participate in this conference. What I'll be talking about really is trying to understand mobility in a post-pandemic world. And the operative word is post-pandemic. I've looked at it, primarily from trying to understand, once this is over, how does it look and where do we come from? And it really takes more of a social perspective in terms of social, political, socioeconomic, and really trying to understand from a user's perspective at the ground level, what is it that's happened to the world of transit and how do we look at changing some of those parameters? So, on the road to a post-pandemic world, mobility systems need to encourage user trust. I think that one of the things we've seen as we've evolved in this pandemic world is that the traditional users of transit have basically been encouraged not to use transit. They've been encouraged to basically stay home under lockdown, under various scenarios. And really, you've seen transit systems kind of creak along with fewer and fewer riderships. And I think one of my favorite numbers was looking at the New York MTA and trying to understand what was going on to ridership in New York City as New York was going through all of the pain and all of the damage that the pandemic was doing. And we saw ridership basically just evaporate, that they were down to like 10% of their normal transit levels. So as people, in fact, were being recommending to stay home and work from home and to stay away from crowds, the public transit systems basically had their revenues totally evaporate. So as we move to a post-pandemic world, the question now is, okay, how do we change the way in which we provide public transit, and how do we engender that trust level back in the public's mind that it is now safe to travel in public transit? So when does this all end? And when do we really become a post-pandemic world? And we've all come to the conclusion that we need a vaccine. The question is going to be, when do we get that vaccine, and how do we distribute it, and how do we get it to most of our communities? And these are not trivial questions. I think that we've all seen the debate and seen the rush that the public health community worldwide have been pushing towards getting a vaccine developed. And we've got all kinds of different tests going on in terms of trying to figure out what is the vaccine answer that we're going to get for COVID-19. And the jury's still out. We're still talking about a vaccine that would take 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, 48 months to basically produce and distribute. And then the question becomes one of how quickly can you get it to the various markets around the world, and to in fact get everybody's level of protection that you need to basically feel comfortable that we've reached a post-pandemic environment. And until such a vaccine appears, we've got some significant public health directives that we've got to deal with. And the CDC, as one example, basically has come up with some very, very specific recommendations in terms of how do you use public transit in getting to and from work, to and from your shopping, to and from visiting friends and families. And they're looking at directives which have, for the most part, prevented people from, in fact, looking at public transit as a viable alternative. They still feel that you need face coverings, you need distancing, and you need proper hygiene on board vehicles in public transit that will, in fact, be used to move passengers, even in a current pandemic world. So those public health directives are kind of flying in the face of trying to restart and to get public transit systems back in place. So it is an ongoing challenge for public transit authorities to move forward. Again, the question about how does the public mobility environment work pre-pandemic. Traditionally, we've been looking at situations where we have a high cost to modernize and build new systems. I think Scott talked about the undercapitalization that we've had in our systems and the trillions of dollars that we are looking to put into the system to bring them up to speed and bring them up to modern technology and modern practices. And it is something that is an immense challenge. The question now becomes one of, are we building the right systems and are we building the right infrastructure to look at it post-pandemic? The other side of the coin is that when you in fact look at modernization and the capital that's required to invest, there's disruption. The disruption that's being provided or being demonstrated to the communities in which this investment is being made. We are tearing up streets, we're tearing up highways, we're tearing up interstates to basically look at this investment in new infrastructure being made. And there's disruption. And there has been some issue about how much disruption is too much disruption. And is it really worthwhile to in fact look at that disruption while we build these new systems? And the focus has always been, again, as Scott mentioned, moving people from suburban to city core. And how do we in fact improve the time spent by a suburbanite basically moving on the transit systems, bringing them to city core and then bringing them back home. So we're talking about situations where we had peak utilization during rush hours. So between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. local time and between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. local time, we have basically pushed people onto the transit systems. And we basically have looked at, other times of the day where you have significant underutilization of the systems. So we've gone through a situation where we've built systems and we've built transit networks to handle the peak for the most part. Whether it's, we kind of look maybe just handling just short of the peak, but we're looking at trying to make sure that we meet at least 90% of the peak demand by bringing these systems into play. Post-pandemic, Scott talked about a few of those issues in terms of some of the scenarios. What's the impact of working from home going to be on demand to and from the city core? Are our city cores still going to be as utilized as they were prior to the pandemic? Are we going to be looking at people basically telecommuting, e-learning, and in fact, reducing the need for transit capacity to and from the city core? A question will become also of looking at the hygiene requirement for both users as well as the infrastructure. When we talk about post-pandemic, are people going to really feel comfortable about going back to the state of the systems that we currently have or we had prior to the pandemic? We've done a lot of work in cleaning up and sanitizing and increasing the hygiene level involved in our transit vehicles. Question is that going to be maintained? Should it be maintained? And how do we maintain it? And are our customers, public transit, people users of our transit systems, going to be looking at having that level of hygiene being maintained beyond the pandemic? And then the distancing needs to increase the use of personal vehicles. Again, the question is going to be one of saying, CDC saying, use your car. Use your cars, don't use public transit at this point in time. Does that stay? Does that stick? Are we looking at an increased number of vehicles and we're looking at increased taxing of our city infrastructures for automobiles? And so the question then becomes one of saying, okay, how have we in fact designed our mobility systems to basically minimize the impact of vehicles in the city core? And is that something that we have to deal with in terms of growth? So when we talk about the factors influencing mobility choices, the public health guidelines on a return to work protocol, you're going to be looking at employers offering incentives to drive to work alone in your car. Transit will be trying to offer 6-foot social distancing. Employers will be trying to stagger the work days to reduce the peaking. Those are all guidelines being offered to us by different public health authorities worldwide to look at trying to figure out how do you in fact minimize the spread of the virus in these times. The issue is going to be also with our policy leaders, with the political side of the business. We seem to have a lot of inconsistency with international leadership policies, national leadership policies, local leadership policies that are conflicting in nature, that really are causing different messages to go out to the transit public. And I think that we need to have some consistency. We need to have some assurance that we're all talking the same language and have the same objectives in mind. Unfortunately, today, in our times as we evolve through this pandemic, it is very apparent that we still have a significant amount of dialogue that's conflictual among our political leadership. And then the willingness of the population to act on policies. And that's more on the social side. As much as we in fact look at people trying to, take actions in terms of protecting themselves in a post-pandemic or in a pre-pandemic world, you're looking at trying to make sure that individuals have the incentive to in fact act upon things like social distancing, like face coverings, like hygiene. And really we were having again, a wide variety of responses by the population in terms of ensuring that these policies are put in place. And the evolution and the progress of COVID-19 is something that's on everybody's mind. We've all heard second wave, we've all heard third wave. We're all sitting back and trying to figure out when will this end. And the scenarios that Scott mentioned earlier, trying to figure out, how do we look at, when do we in fact progress forward in terms of releasing or removing some of these constraints that we have on using public transit, and what are the risks associated with that relaxation of rules when we get hit with a second wave or a third wave. So it really is a question of understanding, how quickly can we react when a second wave does show up, when a third wave shows up, and how do we in fact make sure that we don't have the level of disruption that we experience in most of our communities with the first wave of the coronavirus. So the future of mobility is really going to talk about the extent of mobility disruption. And so we're going to try to understand what the lingering economic impact that this COVID-19 virus has had on mobility, on public transit, what the social impact is, and the safety impact. Those three impacts are going to be there. And I don't have the answer. I don't think anybody really has the answer of how disruptive COVID-19 will be. And some of the economic impacts are still to be determined. We've seen GDPs across the world, get impacted significantly. And have we seen the end of it? Have we seen the bottoming out of some of these impacts? Probably not. And the issue is going to be one of trying to figure out, as soon as we do bottom out, how quickly can we in fact recover? Uncertainty will continue to drive the decision making. As Scott mentioned, we don't know the answer. It's still out there in terms of trying to figure out timelines. When do we give an all clear signal? How do we give an all clear signal? What is an all clear going to look like? And what do we do in terms of looking at coming back? Do we snap back to our pre-pandemic lifestyle and socialization and use of systems? Or do we take some of our current practices and our current processes and maintain them in the future? And define what that new system is going to look like is going to be something we're going to be challenged with. And then, what are the lingering changes to the use of mobility systems? Where do we go from here? What changes are going to be institutionalized into moral systems that we currently have in this pandemic environment? So, the end of the presentation is never let a good crisis go to waste. We basically have to make sure that we take the lessons we learned from our various responses to the pandemic and really try to figure out, what is it about the pandemic that's caused us to change? What are those things that we think are valuable going forward that we should maintain? And what things should be in fact going back to our pre-pandemic world? So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Carla.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I love that last quote in your presentation, because crisis brings out sometimes the very best and sometimes the very worst, but that very best and the thinking that comes along with it, how to then continue to drive that kind of behavior, that initiative is critical, because many times we go into crisis and we come out and we just go back to whatever we were comfortable with before, and we don't take those learnings. So next I have Ryan Kelly from Hyperloop, who is going to take us to a different world, so to speak, and talk about what's happening in Hyperloop and Hyperloop One. Ryan.
Thank you so much, Carla, Scott, and John. Thank you for a very nice transition to talk a little bit about opportunities for the future. So once again, my name is Ryan Kelly. I am the head of marketing communications for Virgin Hyperloop. I'm going to try to see if I can move my slides, which I can't. So if you don't mind clicking to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. When it comes to transportation and the way that we think about it at Virgin Hyperloop, we're really thinking in terms of giant leaps forward. And as far as transportation goes, transportation has revolutionized and changed the world in which we live. And I know I'm going way back, but imagine what the world would be like without the automobile. Imagine what our world would look like without rail or planes, etc. And so it has always created opportunities for people, obviously complicated by what's going on with COVID, but we truly believe at Virgin Hyperloop that we are creating the next new mode of mass transportation. And when you think about it, we're way overdue. There actually hasn't been a new mode of mass transportation in over 100 years. If you think about that in terms of the United States, the last giant leap forward we had in the US was after World War II, when President Eisenhower decided to create the interstate highway system. And that was a model, from almost 100 years ago, or a little bit less than that. But you also think about even things like high-speed rail, which haven't been adopted in the United States. There is no high-speed rail in the US. That's actually technology from the 1970s. And so, how do we move forward? What is the next leap forward? And so when we think about Hyperloop technology specifically, imagine if we could, next slide, please. Imagine if we could shrink distances that normally take hours and change that into minutes. What kind of opportunity would that provide? It would change the way that we live. It would change the places that we could work. It would change the way that supply chains develop, cargo, freight, shipping. So these are some examples here: Chicago to Columbus, 45 minutes, Chicago to Pittsburgh in 60 minutes, Pittsburgh to Columbus in 30. Or next slide, some of the other places that we're working with: Dallas, Kansas City, St. Louis. These are all cities that are actually considering looking at Hyperloop technology in order to create these mega cities. And so as we look towards the future, what we're really trying to do is take a step back, and a lot of what was said in Scott and John's presentation are things that we think about a lot. How do we create a value proposition for the 21st century? How do we use the digital revolution to actually create something new and exciting and innovative? How do we allow cities to evolve? You know, if we think that 2/3 of populations are going to live within cities by 2050, as Scott mentioned before, how are we actually going to make that possible? Because we know now that adding another lane to a highway actually doesn't solve the problem at all. What it actually does is, you know, it induces demand for more cars. And so that's not going to help our congestion problem. I live in Los Angeles, and I see that firsthand almost every day, pre-COVID, although traffic has been a little bit lighter as of late. But it also speaks to the sustainability problems that we are going to have in the future as well. And we can't lose sight of those things as we move forward. So if we go to the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about what Hyperloop is. I'm sure you've heard rumblings of this. Is this tunnel thing with Elon, or, you know, it's just a fast train in a tube? I don't understand why a tube is there. But just to be very, very clear, Hyperloop is actually a new category of transportation. So if someone capitalizes the word Hyperloop, Virgin Hyperloop is a proper, but Hyperloop by itself is a category just like car or train. And actually, governments around the world have recognized that since we came out of the garage about 6 years ago at this point. So it's a really exciting opportunity, and governments and stakeholders are taking this seriously as we move forward towards certification and commercialization. And so to be clear again, Hyperloop is a mass transit solution. That's where we think that there is opportunity connecting cities. But we are combining that with personalization, which we'll talk about in a second. But you start with a pod that can either carry passengers or cargo. So you can actually think about it the same way you think about an interstate highway system, where you could have a truck carrying cargo, or you could have a car carrying passengers. So same kind of focus, which makes it very, very different than rail, where these cars are connected. So the pods actually sit within this tube. We suck out the atmospheric pressure in that tube to about 200,000 feet above sea level. That allows us to use less energy than high-speed rail, and allows us to go as fast as a plane to about the equivalent of 670 miles per hour. We are able to reach those speeds with the power of a proprietary magnetic levitation system that can withstand that low pressure environment, and that propels us forward. Hyperloop would not exist today because there has been talk of tube travel over the last century. But the really important part and why the economics work out for a Hyperloop system is actually found within the autonomous control platform. And without the digital revolution, we would not be able to embed that software into our hardware to create that revolution. So let's talk a little bit about value and what this provides. I talked a little bit before about sustainability, and for us, this is a no negotiation zone for us. The future is in clean energy. It's in batteries, and we want to move forward and be in 100% electric system. That means we have zero direct emissions on the environment. So as we can go just as fast as a plane or a little bit faster, but for short haul flights, we're about 10 times more energy efficient than air travel. Now I will say, you know, that we actually are working with airlines. We're a Virgin company, as you know, so we're all part of the ecosystem here. There's enough to go around, and actually airports are really interested in using us to potentially even connect airports together or connect airports to city centers, and not even the closest city center to their closest city, but can we actually connect more cities to an airport in a city that may be 4 or 5 hour drive away. So there's a lot of opportunities for multimodal as well. So where it gets different than a train, and I mentioned this before, is the on-demand and direct-to-destination component of our system. So we balance personalization and mass transit together. And so actually, our pods can hold anywhere from 16 to 28 people. Now you may turn around and say, that doesn't feel like mass transportation to me. But what we're actually able to do is convoy those vehicles together, like cars that are right behind each other on a lane of a highway. So you can think about our tube actually as a dedicated lane to our system, and then there are actually ramps off, so there is no mechanical switching like a train. So unlike a train where you couldn't have two high-speed rails right next to one another that are going in different directions because you would need to move the mechanical switch, we don't have that problem. So we're actually able to veer our pods off, more akin to turning your blinker on and leaving the highway to go where you need to go. And this is a huge factor when it comes to time saving as well. We're also a completely autonomous vehicle, so we're trying to avoid human error in addition. Finally, from a land use perspective, if we look at different infrastructure projects, it was really important for us to minimize land use. And so we can actually have the amount of land that we need for rail in our tube. In addition, our tunneling cost is about half the cost of the infrastructure for rail as well. So if we go to the next slide, one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, 670 miles per hour, that does not feel very comfortable. I get nervous in small spaces. I'm not sure if this is for me. And we take safety very seriously. We have a large hill to climb to get people comfortable with what we're doing. And so there are a couple of things inherent that actually make our system safer in some ways by mitigating or deleting risk that other modes of transport have. And so I mentioned before that we are an autonomous system, but we are also, in addition, an enclosed environment where we avoid at-grade crossing and human error. So what I mean by that, if you have an autonomous vehicle that is not in a dedicated lane, you could have vehicles that swerve into it or create human error. There is no way that there is any vehicle or any person that is getting in that tube. That's a different problem, but it is that enclosed environment and no weather delays as well. So this is a huge concern. And so when we're talking to regulators all around the world, like DG Move or the DOT in the United States, this is something that they take into consideration. I mentioned before, we have no mechanical switches. So that, again, mitigates some of that risk. We also have no rail wear and tear because you're actually levitating over a track. And then your acceleration will actually be closer to a train at about 0.2 Gs. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to play a video for you really quickly, and we'll make sure we put this in the chat box as well. But did want to talk a little bit about what's happening in a COVID environment. So I mentioned that our system is a grade 4 automation, and basically what we can do, because we have these smaller pods, is actually change the type of service depending on what environment we're in. And so this is actually showing real data from BART in San Francisco. So we actually overlaid a Hyperloop system onto the BART system. So during normal operations, the system would actually utilize capacity as efficiently as possible to move as many people as possible per pod as possible and utilize that space. However, let's say that we had social distancing in place where we have to be 6 feet away from one another. We can actually basically within minutes change the algorithm within our system that controls the entire system, where we can have a physical distance operations. And so what we would do is have the amount of people that could get on per pod, but you could actually run more pods in order to move the same amount of people, but at a safer distance apart from one another. And just so you know, as far as portals, and we won't be getting into portal design or anything today, we have a completely decentralized system. And so there will be really no waiting time, and the amount of people that will be congregating in one place for a long period of time will also be fairly limited. So if we go to the next slide, and then you can actually click on to the next slide as well, because I think I would want to show some of this video. So this is our DevLoop site. And so we've actually shown and proven the technology for Hyperloop. And this is the site in which we did it. This is a video that we did in 2017, where we showed the first Hyperloop system working in that low pressure environment using our proprietary magnetic levitation system. So the tube track was about 500 meters. It's actually the third largest vacuum structure in the world. Our little fun fact out in the desert. And the top speed that was reached was 240 miles per hour. And that was only limited by the amount of tube and track that we have. So it accelerated for 300 and it broke for 200. So if we go to the next slide, please, that's great. So technology is one thing, but how do we actually get this implemented in practice? So we've been working with governments around the world, and I really like, Scott, what you were referring to before. We are not trying to disrupt government. We are trying to work with government to solve some of these problems. And so, the cities and the countries that we're working with are saying, we don't have a solution to this problem. If you are willing to provide a solution to this problem, we want to explore that together. But really, how does this fit within our ecosystem? And so from the very beginning, from the ground up, we have been thinking about how do we create a Hyperloop system? What are the economics of that? How do we make it equitable? And how do we connect it to other modes of transportation for last mile, et cetera? And so you can see some of the folks that we're working with here. I'm sure you've potentially even seen some of this news around the world, but I want to give two specific examples of things that we are working on the horizon. So if we go to the next slide here, I want to talk a little bit about our India project. And so I think this has probably globally been the largest project that we've been working on. We've actually been named the original project proponent for a Hyperloop system and procurement process between Mumbai and Pune. Huge cities, huge populations, huge density issues at this point that they need to solve. And these are two of the most populated cities within India. And so this case study is, one of the best, I think, in the world that we have seen. It would actually be completely privately invested in. It would be a P3 deal, but it would be the largest private infrastructure project in the state of Maharashtra. Not saying that would work for everywhere around the world, but for this case specifically, it's a really good starter project for us. And so we would be able to move about 150 million passenger journeys annually. That equates to about 16,000 passengers per hour. Over its life cycle, it would create 1.8 direct and indirect million jobs, and about 36 billion in socioeconomic benefits. And so one of the things hopefully we can discuss later in Q&A is, what are governments thinking about infrastructure projects right now? And, this is an active project that they think could potentially stimulate the economy. If we go to the next slide, a little bit closer to home, we are also working on the US Hyperloop Certification Center. And so we have our test site out in Nevada, but we are also, we actually went out with a proposal to form the certification center, which would be about 6 to 10 miles long, somewhere in the United States, in conjunction with the NET Council under DOT, and that stands for Non-Traditional and Emerging Transportation Tech Council. And so Hyperloop has been named in that council. How do we safety certify that? We are ready to go. We want to be able to create this infrastructure in order to lead the industry and expedite us getting to market for passenger use. And so we had 17 states apply. We are going to choose where that center is by the end of the year. And we are hoping to achieve certification by the year 2025. And I will end on that note and turn it back over to Carla. Can't wait to continue the conversation with my colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. I have a very fast question. I'm wondering, did you have to change the interior layout or the HVAC system, or are you waiting?
So what was funny, it's a great question. We were actually going to reveal our passenger pod at the World's Fair this year in Dubai. Unfortunately, that has been moved. But we are looking at that, specifically microbials and materials.
Yep.
We're taking another look at that. I think the pro to where we are right now is that we have the luxury that we don't have to retrofit a system at this point. And so that is absolutely on our minds. And really what we're finding is that really the filtering system, the air filtering system is really key to that. So that's where we're investing a lot of our energy.
Thanks. I just have a couple of slides and I am unable to share either. So if you could cascade it down to the next one for me. And it's just a few thoughts I want to throw out there. Some of them are similar to what you've already heard. So I'll move through it very quickly. Next page, please. So this basically shows really how complex the system of connected, automated, and intelligent transportation systems are. And you have to have all three pieces, and you have to have all of the various subsystems in each of those areas to then come through with automated driving and self-driving cars at the end of the day. You can have various portions of that, and we see it with tolling, we see it with different kinds of rapid transit, we see it with platooning, et cetera, but you have to have all three of these to really have automated transit and self-driving vehicles. And as somebody mentioned earlier, late 30s, you know, our data is showing maybe a little bit later than that. But it depends now how things go with COVID and the necessity of changing and accelerating technologies. Next page, please. So this is exactly what somebody said earlier. Private vehicles can only scale so much. Right now we have the CDC telling people to drive their own vehicles. We can add lanes, but what happens when we add lanes? We simply fill them up. It just happens every single time. So it's not the answer to the congestion problems that exist. And if cities continue to grow at the rate that we were anticipating pre-COVID, we know that this will only get worse. And also if people actually start going back in the office. So there's a lot of ifs. Next page. So when we think about what cities have done and continue to do, even through COVID, is really trying to create a multimodal world where platooning, micro cars, scooters, bicycles, public transit can all coexist and coexist safely. And that really is the key, that there has to be infrastructure provided so that everybody, regardless what kind of mobility they're using, feels safe to use it, safe and secure. That requires a lot more than just cleverness in terms of the mobility solution, but it requires regulations, public policy, and in some cases, incentivization to make people change their behavior to be able to have a multimodal city. Next page. So this just demonstrates the longer the trip, the opportunities for different kinds of mobility, from walking all the way up to owning a car, morphs as you get further, as the ride gets longer. Now, of course, I'm not including Hyperloop at this stage, but clearly, you know, that fits in here as well. But you can see going all the way from micromobility through mass transit, you know, really looking at the flexibility and convenience on the Y and then the distance on the X. We believe, you know, really smart mobility has an integration of all of these modes, and you use whichever one is most efficient for your purposes. Next page. So then sometimes we forget that people are involved here, and people have very strong feelings about what's acceptable, what they trust. And as we've already seen with some of the pilots that have been done and ramifications have happened, that trust wanes, and it takes a while to get that trust back. So if we go to the next page, we can talk a little bit about public policy and values. So on the left side of this, we see what we have today, which is basically a congested roadway. We have road rage. You can see Michael Douglas there in the left if you've seen that movie. And then you see, you know, a poorly designed bus station or bus stop with somebody standing in the middle of a very busy intersection with just a sign there. Then being a Jetsons lover, if you look on the right-hand side, we went to the air, but we applied the same rules. And because of that, we still have traffic jams during rush hour. We still have road rage in the bottom right. George is pretty excited there with the drivers around him. And then we have the maid is the one who's riding the bus. So we didn't change anything. We didn't equalize mobility. We didn't provide those ladders because we didn't change any of the rules. We didn't think about public policy. We didn't think about human behavior. So we need to really think about that as we morph into new technologies. Next page. And again, each city is different. And within that city, there can be neighborhoods that are different. And we need to think about not just big cities, but suburbia, rural, exurban. Everybody has mobility issues. They require different solutions. You have different demographics, you have different climates, you have different cultures. And then of course, now we have COVID to deal with on top of all of this. So really, what kind of solution is going to work best? It might be a plethora of solutions depending on the makeup of the area that you're dealing with. Next page. So when we look at, you know, the pandemic and what's happened, I don't need to repeat all of this, but I mean, we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen with public transit. We don't know if people will feel comfortable to use it and how quickly. Depends if there's another wave and another wave. We do know home delivery has escalated and probably in many cases will not go back. That will stay, the delivery of goods. And the adoption of teleworking. We've seen lots of companies that are saying, you know what, this is working. People are working from home. It's kept the congestion down. It's saving them 2 hours, 3 hours a day. You know, it doesn't make sense to keep this office space. Is that long lasting? There's been so many debates about this over the years, and each of these decisions will make a difference in terms of how we start to move people around and by what means. So I think that concludes my portion. If you change it, this just says we need to be equitable. So instead of just saying smart mobility, we now say smart and good mobility, thinking about mobility for all and ladders of opportunities. And the last page is just a thank you slide in my poor memory. So if we can move to that, we can skip that. I already spoke about that. Yeah. So then it just talks about what CAR can do in terms of research. So let's move into the panel discussion. We have a good 30 minutes. I know I have one question that's come in from the audience. One thing, you know, that I kind of want to kick off is, are we going to go back to pre-pandemic? And, you know, what kind of length of time are we looking at where people's thoughts are really changed, or are they changed already? And I kind of wanted to start with John on this one, and then maybe Scott and Ryan can weigh in.
I think though, you know, what we're looking at is, you know, that it's really a mindset that we're trying to figure out, you know, how is it going to change, and how much of the change that people have in fact seen over the last 2 or 3 months, how much of that is going to stick, and how much of that is going to stay in their memories, and are people willing to in fact revert to the former mode, or they want to stay with the current mode. And I think that's where, you know, the length of time that we are going to be in this pandemic mode is in fact going to be a key driver of behavior. And I think that's where we're going to have a bit of a hard time today trying to figure out, you know, what's this going to look like, when it's going to stop. And there is no answer. as Scott mentioned earlier, we really have no idea when do we hit bottom and when do we start coming back out, and what does coming back out really mean? So good question. Unfortunately, we don't have the answer.
We don't know. And what's it going to mean for cities? You know, we kept talking about the growth in cities. They're just going to, the young people are going to flock to the city. They want to have that city environment. They're not going to own a car. Now I'm hearing and seeing from some realtors, people are now saying, I'm moving the heck out of the city. I'm getting out of here. I can telework. You know what, Scott, do you have any trends about that? What are you seeing and the stickiness of that?
I don't have hard data. I have lived in New York City since the day I graduated college, and it's 4 decades. And I am a big urbanist. I love cities. And I am heartbroken by what New York is going through right now. But I think what's really interesting is why are cities such magnets? They've been magnets for talent. They've been magnets for economic opportunity. New York has been a magnet for immigrants all over the world for a better life. I think that there are attributes and qualities to cities that are irreplaceable. And no offense, I like seeing all of you on this digital screen, but I would have been a million times happier if we'd been physically together. And people are really social beings. One of the interesting, I think it's too early, but one of the interesting things that's happening right now is the rise in active mobility. It's not that everyone's jumping into cars to drive into New York City. New York isn't even open really yet, right? It's slowly reopening. And by the way, the people who are there tend to actually be younger people who have remained and don't have options outside of the city in many respects, or the people who have borne the brunt of keeping the city going, from healthcare workers to transit workers who've been on the front line of all of this. But one of the things that's really interesting, in New York, it has never been a bike city. You can't buy a bicycle in New York City right now. They're completely sold out. And we have bike sharing, but what's interesting is that people are not comfortable even with the idea of touching handlebars with gloves and Purell and all that kind of stuff. But the idea of having your own personal bike to be able to get around, nothing would be cooler than New York City to be a biking capital akin to, its namesake, old Amsterdam, and sort of seeing it play out that way. But we don't actually have the infrastructure. I'll give you one example. I live north of the city and live all of 3 miles to my office at 30 Rock. If I wanted to ride a bike, and I will ride a bike when we reopen, there isn't a bike rack anywhere near 30 Rock to lock a bicycle. So something as simple as that, which is, what does that cost? It costs virtually. So there are impediments to these transitions, but I think you're going to see communities where they say organically, we want to do things that are different. I do hope that the smart materials and smart sanitizing and self-cleaning, we're going to need that, particularly for mass transit. The city can't function if we don't have a viable and efficacious mass transit system. It's impossible. So I'm speaking from my heart. I hope that that people don't all move out of cities and move into their, and live outside and cities sort of die. And I really don't think that will happen. I think and one example, just one analogy that I think is really telling, is right after 9/11, people who lived in Tribeca, just north of the trade towers, there was a massive sell-off of private residences. And within 5 years, the value of those apartments skyrocketed. People moved right back in. So it took people being assured of safety to get to be there. And that is, John talked about it, it is the sine qua non of what will determine the pathway forward.
And I think that, when you look at, what does, everybody's talking about the new normal. I get really upset when people use that term, because what is new normal? It's just that we will change. We will definitely change our behaviors. We will change the way we commute. And the question is going to be one of, what's that change going to look like? And do we go back to the cities that we've known in the past, as Scott has longing for. And the question is going to be one of saying, what does society think about the world that we created and the impact of that world in managing a pandemic? And I think, we have to understand that, people are going to be judging our society 5-10 years from now, looking at, okay, how did we do? What are the strengths and weaknesses of our system that basically helped us get through this pandemic? And it was pretty obvious that, New York being the epicenter, of the first wave, there were some things about New York that drove the pandemic to the extent that it did. And people are going to say, is that something we want to recreate? Is there something about what we've learned about the New York experience that should change as we evolve our society post-pandemic? So, and I don't have the answer. I mean, I think it's too early to tell whatever's going on in Vegas or in Arizona or in Florida or in California. What's the right size of city? What's the right infrastructure that we should get in order for us to make sure that we keep ourselves safe in the future world? And I think that there's still a lot of, history that has to go under, we have to go through a lot of history to figure out what the answer should be.
Hey,
the
Ryan.
general answer today is that, is the New York model the right model that we should go back to in order for us to be able to go through another round of pandemics?
Yeah, or is there something we can learn from other municipalities as well? I suppose we do have to, I think, look at all the different case studies and for our future learning. Ryan, I have a question for you about Hyperloop, especially, when you think about deployment and that, I don't know what year we're looking at for that, but considering, the mass boon in deliveries of goods and food, and if you think about, farm to table, that kind of thing, do you see Hyperloop firstly being for kind of the good side of the world and then people, or both at the same time? And then my second question is, if it's people or simultaneously people, how are you going to build that trust? What's your idea?
Sure. So we are looking at a system that can do both. So for us, cargo is about on-demand goods. And so to your point, it wouldn't be moving coal as an example. So, it wouldn't be cost efficient or effective to do anything like that. But we would be looking at on-demand goods that you would get on an Amazon, et cetera. You're looking at perishable goods. You're looking at medicine, anything like high value that people will pay a premium for to get it quickly. But again, you can think about the Hyperloop more as an interstate highway in a way. I'm not saying that we are another lane on an interstate highway by any means, but that both passengers and cargo can be on that system simultaneously. And so you could imagine, for example, if you have a rush hour situation between Mumbai and Pune, New York and DC, et cetera, that during rush hour, majority of those pods will have people in them, and maybe in off-peak hours, maybe that's a time where we can shift and move cargo as well, depending, on what the numbers tell us. But and by the way, when we look at our investors, we have Virgin on one side, who is more about that passenger and person experience, and have, decades and decades. Virgin is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year as a company, but they are definitely are folks helping with passenger experience. But we also have Dubai Ports World, and they, I believe, own 1/3 of cargo ships in the world, and I think run about 70 plus ports all over the world as well. And so they're looking at Hyperloop. They're a major investor of ours, and they're seeing this as a cargo opportunity as well. But to get back to your question about making people feel comfortable, I think really from a messaging standpoint, and this is directly in my lane and my responsibility at the company, but making people feel comfortable with chunks of the system and being able to relate it back to mass infrastructure or transportation infrastructure that they're used to. And so when people say 670 miles per hour, that must be very uncomfortable and feel like a roller coaster. You explain the difference between speed and acceleration and G-forces and what that actually means. And so you're able to walk around in an airplane once it takes off, and then explaining that the G-force is actually going to be closer to rail. Then we talk a little bit about safety and what that looks like, and the idea of that closed environment at grade crossings, etc. I think the real challenge for Hyperloop, to be honest, is getting people comfortable with a smaller space that has no windows. And so that is something that we are working on from a design perspective, actually with a couple of our partners that work on fuselages of planes. We actually just announced our development partnership with Spirit Aerosystems, and we're working with a couple of designers of Boeing aircraft and whatnot, interiors, and going through focus groups and psychological studies on that. So more to come. We'll be releasing some of that this year.
What about virtual reality? Are you thinking about that at all, to be able to get rid of that anxiety of the MRI machine?
Yeah, so actually it's funny that you mentioned that, because I don't want to give away everything here, but we actually were thinking of actually reducing screens for a couple of different reasons. We actually want this to be kind of this effortless, very calming experience. And so we actually found that putting screens everywhere actually can give a little bit of anxiety or eye strain. And so people are actually, and you're seeing this, and actually this is something that I think in a post-COVID world is going to change on airlines, for example. People aren't going to want to touch the screens anymore. They're going to want to bring their own devices. And you're seeing that a lot of people bring iPads and whatnot. So we want it to be enabled for a screen that you bring. And that's where we think the industry is going. But virtual windows and things like that, of course, we are exploring, but there are other things that we can do. So for example, when we're talking about safety, what kind of seats do we need? As an example. So people think airline seats and that's what we need, but actually not necessarily. So it could look like a more open space when you chop off like some of that seat heading, so that you can actually see within the cabin, that creates space, if you will. Even thinking about things like skylights, where you can actually create almost this natural light design pattern to make people feel good. And then also just ventilation in general is going to be really, really important.
So, John, did you have a comment? It looked like you were going to speak.
Yeah, I was going to say something in terms of the technical infrastructure associated with Hyperloop. And I've been an aficionado of high-speed transportation for years. So the question, is going to be, maglev has been around for a while, and I've passenger on the Shanghai maglev at the airport, 430 kilometers an hour, and pretty impressive in terms of its capability. But it's never taken off. maglev is basically a technology seen that the world has kind of moved away or not really interested in it, primarily because of cost, I think. And I think that's where, what is it about maglev that makes Hyperloop, pick that technology versus, wheel on steel wheels?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we probably have time to go into it now, but that's why when we talk about Hyperloop, we don't think about it like a train, right? So we actually are more of an autonomous electric vehicle within a tube itself. And so we can actually create efficiency basically through our software platform on top of the vehicle to go direct to destination and optimize the amount of seats that we can bring. So from an operational expense point, we're not running a very expensive train where the seats are half filled, as an example. We're also, not having to electrify the track or reposition the track as well. So Chinese rail, as an example, they have to go in and they have to realign the tracks all the time, and that becomes very expensive. And, we don't have to do any of those kind of things. So, proof is in the pudding, right? And so that's why we're doing feasibility studies, and we're going through that right now, but we are very much aware of that and think about that quite often.
Maglev 2.0.
I'd like to pick up on what Ryan is.
Then I have a question for Scott after you add your comment.
I think really this question of, are we going back is completely the wrong question. We aren't going back. We're going to something very different. But I think the characteristics of where we're going, your photograph on congestion, right? Adding more cars and single occupant cars, which is a big chunk of the problem, just isn't, it's not sustainable, it's not viable. That model has kind of run its course. We can't just keep, so there are these new technologies emerging where we're going to decarbonize transportation. We're going to make it a lot cleaner. We have to deal with the climate issue. If we thought this pandemic was bad, let me tell you, if climate change really hits the way we imagine, we just actually had an experiment where we shut down our economies and saw clean air for the first time in cities. In LA, Salita Reynolds, who was on a panel with me, the head of the DOT, said she could actually see the ocean 12 miles away with clean air and no smog. Think about that. Like, who wants to go back to smog? Who wants to go back, right? So the real question is, how do we take the existing systems and migrate them and evolve to take advantage of the power of these technologies and do it in a way that's cost effective, both on a capital cost and an operating cost? And the problem, the real problem with this, and it started actually with the very first thing we did in Future Mobility, is implicit to this, there are winners and losers, and no one wants to talk about that. The old legacy incumbents want to protect their market position, it's understandable. And the disruptors, actually, they're not interested in sort of incrementalizing a broken system with negative externalities. They're interested in reinventing and starting with a clean sheet. And the battle we've been having for the last 5 years has been actually those two sets of players wrestling this out. And the part that I think really hits now is if we have all this federal aid going to legacy incumbents to basically just keep their existing business models going, that includes airlines, that includes the automakers, that includes mass transit players. Well, that's taking capital out that could be used in a transformative way. And then secondly, if the private sector funding starts to dry up, then, you know, if Virgin is unable to secure more investors for Hyperloop, then the grand vision and the potential of that technology, which is amazing, will just be slow. It may happen, it just may be slow. So I'm hopeful that we somehow figure out how to break through the Gordian knot that seems to be in front of us. And I ultimately believe exactly where you are, Carla. This actually happens at a very local and organic level. And it's communities of stakeholders that come together with a very human-centered design of thinking about what works for their communities. And somehow we have to figure out how to foster that dialogue so it's really constructive and we can move forward.
So Scott, you spawned about 3 or 4 questions while I was listening to you, but you know, let me start with first a comment, then a question. I thought I loved living in suburbia till I moved to Tokyo, and I found out, similar to you, that I'm really a city kid at heart. I love it there. I love being in the center of everything. I didn't like the congestion. I didn't like the air quality. These are the trade-offs, right? At least currently. What cities are doing this right? What cities are really forming the public-private partnerships that are needed, starting the trials? I'm sorry, I've got somebody at the door. You know, and what are the best practices that you've seen in your work?
Yeah, so the work we did with the World Economic Forum, I think one of the standout cities is Singapore. And the reason that Singapore is so impressive is that they've been dealing with rising sea levels for a long time, and the recognition that in a very existential way, they need to deal with climate change. And what they've done, which you don't see in most cities, is that they have capitated the number of cars that are in operation. So if you want to buy a new car, you actually have to buy the license from someone who has the right to a car that gets taken out of the system. So it's like cap and trade that we had back in the 80s here in the United States. It's that kind of system. It's very expensive, by the way, to buy that right. And then if you own a car, they have congestion pricing, but it's not just based on time of day and going into the city center, but it's on the number of passengers in a vehicle. And what they've really done is they've invested very heavily in alternative forms of mobility to create options. you can't just penalize people who live in transportation deserts because they have cars and say, good luck, you're on your own, go navigate. You have to create the alternatives so that they have viable alternatives. And as a policy, this I think is really interesting. As a policy, they have said that within 10 or 15 minutes of a walking distance to access a source of mass transit, and no one that lives on the island of Singapore is more than 30 minutes away from the city center. And that affects land use and land policies and mobility and energy. So they've thought about it at a complete systems level, but it creates incredible inclusion and accessibility. And I would venture to guess that it will create much greater economic development and economic growth. Now they have a political system that's a little different that makes that possible in a way that's different than Western democracies. So you could argue, is that really a showcase? Maybe, but it does show you what the art of the possible is.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
how do
Just one brief
cities?
comment.
Oh,
Is it,
go
you know,
ahead.
I think that when you look at where, where we're, Scott's vision about, using Singapore as a model is interesting. I think that, the key message for me when I listen to Scott's description of the Singapore world is really, public policy. You basically draw a line in the sand and say 30 minutes. If you're going to build a city and you're going to build core transportation, nobody can be more than 30 minutes away from the city core. Build your systems, build your transportation access around that objective. And that is probably the one driving force that will in fact allow us to move down that path of achieving climate change objectives, but also maximizing the value that transit can bring to our communities. But we do need a strong political will and a strong political statement about what do we design our cities to look like, and what should transit look like for those inhabitants of that city, and then build our infrastructures around that objective.
Exactly, which is completely turns up urban planning upside down, the normal way we do urban planning.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just talk for a moment? There was a question that came in from the audience about contactless delivery, first mile, last mile, and I think we can expand that beyond just, what does contactless delivery look like in the future? Is it here to stay? But contactless in general for payments and, as Scott was mentioning about bicycles, how will this progress? Has our mindset been changed completely in this regard? Any thought, Scott or John?
I think it's coming. I do recall a few years ago when we were in Columbus together, Carla, and we were talking about when Columbus won the Smart Cities competition, and it was really about creating mobility for poorer neighborhoods and to deal with a very high infant mortality rate,
right,
to create accessibility to get people who lived in transportation deserts to get health care that they desperately needed to save lives. And as we begin to move to more technology, we talked about this, that the issue is you have communities of poor people that are digitally unbanked, and they may have smartphones, but they don't have data plans. So you can't have a digital divide that leaves part of the population out. And there are ultimately solutions that could be created. But if you're going to think about this, you have to think about the system's impact. And our practice is really focused now on how do we create greater inclusion and accessibility, because it's the key. There's a great study that Sandy Pentland did at MIT, where he proved in a causative way, not in a correlative way, that access to networks, physical networks and digital networks, utterly transforms the household wealth of families in different cities. And so it is, this is my opinion, it's not a Deloitte point of view necessarily. Mobility is a human right, and we have to figure out how to make that ubiquitous and available to everybody. Mm-hmm. It's truly transformative. And you know that, you lived it on the front line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It provides those ladders to education, ladders to healthcare. It's interesting now, a study was recently published that said some of these new shuttle services aren't really so cost effective. It wasn't a rocket science study to me, because yes, now they're not, but we're learning, and we have to be able to provide this and do it smartly. And again, it's going to require that public-private partnership to go forward. So we only have about 4 minutes remaining, if my clock is correct. So I wanted to kind of allow you each a chance to kind of give me your 1 minute view of, you know, what things will be, let's say, permanently altered, or what do we need to think about post-pandemic? And maybe post-pandemic means this one is over, but COVID-21 is coming, you know, if we don't change our ways with how we're managing the earth and our resources. So maybe Ryan, we could start with you, and how Hyperloop can bring us into the future with, you know, in conjunction with multimodality, first mile, last mile, contactless, you know, really how it can drive forward some of these visions for the cities that we want to live and work in.
Sure. So I think all the things that we discussed pre-COVID were directions we were going in anyway. You know, how do we create mass transit with personalization, contactless ticketing, all of those different kind of things. I think my message is more one of hope, and, you know, one for potentially a giant leap forward. One of the things that we do, we work a lot with government at a local, federal, state, country level. And one of the things that has given me hope throughout this, because we're obviously very worried about, you know, we're a startup. One is that our investors are still behind us because they see what's coming next. And so it's really hard to break away, specifically in transportation, from the inertia of our past, because infrastructure is really expensive and it needs to be thought about carefully. And we know that it provides value, but sometimes it can get very political. And as we look towards an infrastructure bill that we're hoping to pass in the United States sometime soon, you know, we are encouraged that people are looking to use this opportunity for a giant leap forward and use this opportunity to break away from the inertia. And this goes well beyond transportation. It goes to equality for people, and you know, how do we get people back to work? How do we not just rebuild, but evolve? And so I think really that's what that's all about. And it's not just about Hyperloop. It's about having conversations like this about how we all work together to create that future we want to see.
Fabulous. And John, your last quote in your presentation, I think was great. If you could just give us a few words,
yeah,
you know,
I think
from
that, we have a lot to learn. We're going through this crazy time, and we've got to be able to take the learnings that we've gotten from where we have to go through, and kind of make sure that we pick and choose, you know, what do we want to change to. And I think that it's important that, you know, the way we were in the past, some things worked well, some things did not work well. I think if we look to the future, we can basically look at where is it that we have to change some of our practices. How do we have to look at changing public policy and get our politicians to basically make sure that they talk with one voice. And I think that's the important lesson.
Thanks. And Scott, maybe some closing comments. And we've had a couple people coming in from Brazil wondering, you know, how can we think about this for, you know, some of our cities here, more developing nations versus developed nations. If maybe you could touch on that a little bit in your closing comment.
So I'm with Ryan. I'm actually very hopeful. I think these are complex systems. I think that the part that is really the hardest is how do you get sort of vested interest and vested stakes where we actually begin to think about what the art of the possible is. And one of the good things, it's one of the few good things, is we've been forced in a very Darwinian way to deal with new realities around how we lead our lives. None of us wanted this. God, you know, it's so sad what's happened to 100,000 people. I mean, it's tragic, right? But we've learned that actually there are new ways. And the question is, can we create something on the other side of this that builds on some of the positive things that have come out of this? And I actually think there's an enormous will that people really do want to do things that are transformative. A big impediment is that most people are afraid of what they don't know. It's like Ryan talking about, getting into a Hyperloop. I mean, I maybe might hesitate for a second, only a second. I felt the same way about AVs. I've been in 15 of them. I don't have a concern at all. So it's how do you get people to actually experience what they are and what they might mean, and let's get people to fire up their imaginations, and then let's really create it in a transformative way. But we can't lose sight of the fact that our society desperately needs that we do this in a way that's really open and equal and fair and equitable and creates equity. And I think that this moment may lead us there, actually. It may be a little like this, and I don't blame my children if they're a little mad at all of us who are baby boomers for the mess we kind of put them in. So.
Yeah, I want to make the world a better place for my grandchildren too. So I've already gone over time, Lucian.
This is Lucian, and I've been like a child trying to get in front of you. I try to put some questions in a Q&A, and because I'm a panelist, it doesn't let me. So I want to thank you all for contributing to this. John, Ryan, Scott, I do have a challenge for you folks. I was born in Europe, been in the States for the last 30 years, wondering when can I take the Hyperloop from Cleveland or from Chicago or from New York to Europe? Is there a reality in my life?
Come on. I mean, I hopefully, but that's a whole nother challenge. Let's walk before we run, but we can talk offline about it. We'll set the plans.
I'll turn it back over to Carla. I skipped the session just so I can join yours, and you can see I turn on and off the camera just to be there to ask the question.
Okay, I saw you keep coming on screen. I was wondering your ulterior motive there. And Ryan, I'll be glad to be your first guinea pig. I love the Top Thrill dragster at Cedar Point.
Sounds good.
So I think I have to end this, correct, Lucian or Linda? It's past 5:30.
Correct. If anybody has any last thoughts, you're welcome. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This has been awesome. I enjoyed as much as I could stay here while multitasking, but thank you all for making it. Come back tomorrow. There is a lot of great sessions. There's a keynote on exploiting the value of data with the Chief Innovation Officer of Hitachi Ventura, and 12 other sessions. Thank you.